Yes, I am, guy.
Okay. All right. Mm. All right, here we go. All right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to have some of my guests today, Laura, Regan. Laura, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be back here.
Awesome. So Laura is a holistically and somatically oriented trauma-focused psychotherapist, as well as the board-approved and registered clinical social work supervisor in Maryland. She's a speaker, trauma trainer, and owner of the Baltimore Annapolis Center for Integrative Healing, where she and her associates offer integrative trauma and attachment-focused psychotherapy to teens and adults. In 2021, Laura founded the Trauma Therapist Network, a website resource designed to help people learn about trauma and find therapy. In addition, she hosts two podcasts: Therapy Chat, her most well known, which features interviews with trauma therapists, authors, and researchers, and her second, Trauma Chat, which offers brief episodes that educate both professionals and the general public about trauma and its impact on our lives. We'll be talking about all that and then stuff in more in depth. Laura, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, guys. So good to be with you.
So the first thing I've got to say after reading that bio is, damn girl, you're busy. Like,
You're
how
right
do you
about
do
that. That's
this?
very true. Oh my gosh. Well,
Jesus.
yeah, it's a lot actually, but
Yeah.
over time it's gotten the podcast, as you probably have noticed for yourself, it just sort of begins to roll along. It just has its own rhythm.
Right.
So that's just a thing that's always been like a side thing, but um it takes a lot of my attention, but it's so fun and enriching. It's kind of a creative outlet at the
Yeah.
same time.
Awesome.
But yeah, there have been times where I've had to pull back on seeing clients because I had so much going on. So, it's sort of this like w- what needs your attention the most at a given time, and just continuing to flow with it and try to be
Yeah.
flexible.
Yeah. So we'll get into that a little bit more later, but let's start here with share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Okay. I'm from Virginia in the US, and I currently live in the state of Maryland, which is right next to Virginia, but not as much similar as you might think. Not as much as I expected anyway.
All right, all right. So I mean, you got a lot going on here, and you're going to be kind of guest presenter with the Wisdom Circle, and we're going to talk about that too. But I want to kind of segue into that and kind of uncover and explore how the hell all this started for you. How did you get into this field and trauma specifically too?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I really feel like I stumbled into it, but I also feel like we find what we need to be doing and it kind of finds us. Um, I stumbled so randomly, literally, into volunteering in a sexual assault crisis center when I was in my early 30s. I was going back to school to finish my undergrad and intended to go get my master's and become a therapist. And I needed some kind of internship or some kind of experience in the field because I had been working in the legal field before that. And so I passed by this YWCA. I saw a sign that said volunteers wanted, and I assumed it would be some kind of domestic violence related
Oh,
work. I
okay.
didn't know that sexual violence had services. I knew about domestic violence services, like kind of. So when I contacted them about volunteering, they said, well, this is for our 24-hour rape crisis hotline and hospital accompaniment program. Is that something you're interested in? I was like, ooh, like that sounds hard. As coming off the street, I had no idea what to expect. They said, don't worry, we'll train you. Um, and we went through this very comprehensive 40-hour training that I was so fortunate. This was back in 2002, but I was trained in understanding sexual violence as a, societal problem, not an individual issue, and also that it's a trauma
Mm-hmm.
and it can impact people over their whole lives. So we learned about working with adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, as well as people who had just recently been sexually assaulted or raped. And um, I was just madly passionate about the work. So I couldn't relate to it at all. Like, I'm not a survivor. I have no idea why I'm just a brave person who really wants to do this work. But really, I was a survivor. I didn't even realize it.
Oh,
So it
wow.
was one of those things where, you know, sitting with people, and we would do short-term crisis counseling too. So I started as a volunteer and then started working there in 2003. And I had a small caseload of it was about 15 people, and we would meet for short-term counseling for like 6 to 12 months. So, I thought of that as short term, but
Mhm.
nowadays that's that's long term compared to what a lot of models allow. But um so yeah, even though I was sitting with people who had similar stories to my story of victimization, I didn't relate to it at all because of the valuable skill, the adaptation of dissociation that prevents us from, you know, realizing how we've been impacted by any kind of trauma. So, um, you know, I remember I went to counseling at that time with the intention of becoming a therapist. I thought, and I was told in school, you need to start your own counseling so you can find out, what your issues are and deal with them before you go out there and try to work with other people, which I thought was great advice. But when I went into the counseling, I had zero idea of what might be impacting me whatsoever. So even though I understood about trauma, I didn't relate to the idea that I was a trauma survivor myself at all.
Wow. All right, let me interject for a second. First of all, very intense. I mean, to walk into a situation like that. When you said you were walking by the YMCA and saw volunteering, I thought you were going to say, well, I thought it was for like the basketball court or something like that. But to go into a situation like that and to volunteer for a situation like that, and the way you described it, you were like all in. That's
Mhm.
intense.
Mhm.
And you weren't aware, as you said, of your own survivorhood or past experience consciously, right?
Yeah.
How did you deal with that in the moment when that, because so heavy.
Yeah, it is. Well, it's interesting because if I were to look back on my younger self now, this is more than 20 years ago we're talking about. So if I were to look back on that younger me, I thought I was fine in life. Like, I thought I'm fine. You know what I mean? But I also didn't love myself. I
Mhm.
didn't, I hated my body. I had all of these classic developmental trauma um, symptoms that, are also common experiences of women too, in our culture. So, I just thought I didn't think I didn't love myself because I was traumatized. I thought I didn't love myself because I wasn't lovable. I
Mhm.
thought I just thought I deserved to be mean to myself because
Mm.
I thought I was like a bad person. So, so when I would go and meet with people, we would be on call. So we would get calls in the middle of the night to go meet someone at the clinic for the forensic
Oh, wow.
exam. And, so it felt very noble. It felt very important. And I knew, you would feel the impact in the moment of how helpful it was for that person to have an advocate with them, somebody who could speak up on their behalf, help them feel more empowered through the process, explain what was going on, um, educate them about give them crisis intervention counseling and educate them about trauma reactions, short term and long term, and when to know you need help, when to get counseling versus these are just the common symptoms. If you
Right.
rest and XYZ, you might feel better in a few days or whatever. So, in the short term at least. So it felt so meaningful and it felt so valuable. It made me feel really good about myself. So it was only in certain situations over the next 3 years that I worked there. I worked there for almost 4 years.
Wow.
Um, it was only in certain situations where it would be so close to home in some way that I would I would struggle mainly with like wanting to work more when I was exhausted. So
Mhm.
sort of like, no, I have to do more. I have to do more. I can't take time off and feelings like that. So again, it just looked like typical like vicarious trauma reaction or um burnout, going towards burnout. So I had a supportive supervisor who would just when people were at that point, which everybody did get to that point at some point, multiple times throughout our times working there, she would just encourage us to take time off. She would always
Right.
support us in doing a lot of self-care. So it really wasn't until many, many years later that I recognized my sexual trauma history. I had begun to piece together that I was traumatized from my childhood in general, a lot of attachment wounds, but I didn't really realize about the sexual trauma until about maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Not that it was like a memory that came flooding back. It was
Yeah.
experiences that I already knew about. I remembered everything. It was just I didn't recognize that those experiences to be sexual assault, sexual violence. I looked at them as just bad relationships and things like
Mhm.
that. So that's one of the reasons why I really love um, helping individuals, anybody who's in the general public and therapists, learn more about practicing effectively with trauma or about how trauma shows up in our lives for general public. Because even when you know about trauma, you may not see yourself
Mhm.
in that. You know what I mean? It's like suddenly you go, oh my gosh, all this stuff, that was terrible, and until then you're like, "Mm, my childhood was pretty good."
That is so true. You don't want to or can't identify yourself as having experienced something like that. What an incredible story. So, was that so at this point you were on route to become a therapist?
When I recognized my own
Yeah.
victimization, yeah, I've been a therapist, I graduated from grad school in 2010. So, I've been a therapist for a while now, but yeah, this was maybe like 6 or 7 years ago. So, as while I've been working with trauma survivors of sexual trauma, specializing in this work, I would say, well, I started to think to myself, well, I know those things happen, but it just doesn't have I mean, it fits the definition of sexual violence, but it doesn't have a charge for me. So I guess it just wasn't traumatizing for me. That was kind of where I was getting to until certain point. I'm like, why do I keep having these interpersonal problems in certain situations? It was kind of like problems with setting boundaries and saying no, people pleasing
Mhm.
stuff. And I started to realize there was something I couldn't really get to in my talk therapy. And it was actually through brain spotting. It started with some somatic therapy and kind of led me from recognizing that I was reacting to something that I couldn't reach. And I
Mhm.
realized that there was like a freeze response in my system that I wasn't, you can't get there through just
Right.
talking. And so through the first brain spotting experience I had, which was like a really long 2-hour brain spotting session, I kind of unlocked what was frozen there and it shifted. And then it all kind of began to fall into place. Like, of course.
Wow. Now
So,
was the brain spot you mentioned somatic therapy as well. Had you tried other modalities and other treatments for yourself?
yeah, I had the therapist that I go to now, I've been working with since 2016. So that's 8 years in November.
Well,
Feels like that anniversary just comes around so fast every year. I'm like, wow, another year. Okay. Keep going. We're doing it. We're getting there. But yeah, so that was the first therapist that I worked with who was both attachment focused and used somatic work. And the method he used was focusing.
mhm.
So it's a very, I would say kind of light somatic method compared to things like somatic experiencing, sensory motor psychotherapy. but I'm also trained in sensory motor. I've done levels 1 and 2, so, I didn't do level 2 until 2019, but, I did level 1 in 2015, and, um, all of that, the practice that you do in that work and just becoming more attuned to my inner world through somatic work, both as a practitioner and continuing to work with, like, I do a lot of things. I do energy work with a coach, and I have my weekly therapy with my therapist. And then I do, I go to retreats, and I mean, I just do as
Mhm.
much as I can for healing because, the work we do, it's so intense and there's a
Yeah.
lot to move. You have to keep it moving, I feel.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. 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 All
yeah,
right.
but it was actually like a consultation with somebody who was trained in sensory motor that helped me recognize what was stuck, and then I went from there to brain spotting.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Very cool. So let's jump. You in 2021, you founded the Trauma Therapist Network. Talk to
Yeah.
us about that. What is it?
Okay, so, I started the Trauma Therapist Network website because for years, I've been complaining that it's really hard to find trauma therapists and to find out how they practice. To, trauma is not, it's like an umbrella term. It's a very broad term. And there's so many different ways of practicing, as we just briefly discussed. There's so many different types of trauma and different types of attachment wounds, and how they show up is all different. So what people specialize in is significant to the person who's searching. So I was frustrated that there was really no way to find a trauma therapist that was specific to their way of practicing and what kind of training do they have. Um and then I decided to create it. So I started the website, um where you can search for therapists, and it's very specific with, you know, what they do, what they're trained in, what approach they use. But then I realized too that just like me, even me with a lot of experience in trauma, not recognizing myself as a trauma survivor, although every time I've ever looked for therapy, I've always looked for trauma focused therapy because I feel like all therapy should be trauma focused.
Yeah.
But um, people don't recognize themselves as trauma survivors. And I know for myself with my clients, you know, oftentimes we spend years just trying to help them actually recognize and accept that the way they feel is not because there's something wrong with their brain, but it's because of their experiences, usually
Mhm.
during childhood. So I needed the website to also be educational for people so they can learn about, yeah, trauma is not what you think it is. It shows up in ways that you might not expect. A lot of the common mental health symptoms that people have are actually because of childhood trauma, and the traumatic experiences we have as adults. I mean, just as an example, like it's 2024. We all went through a worldwide pandemic. Millions of people died. Everybody was terrified. Everything changed in an instant. Nobody knew
Right.
what was going on or what to do. That's a that's a collective trauma that everyone experienced. Not everyone had the same reaction to it, but that happened. And now you see so many people newly identifying that they have ADHD.
Mhm.
And I'm like, I'm not saying that people don't have ADHD, but
Right.
I'm curious,
Right.
you know, if these symptoms might actually be related to this worldwide traumatic experience that we all had, but it's just the last thing that people expect to be the cause of the way they feel, because we all think, well, people think that trauma is this like big bad thing that happens to other people and not to us. So I wanted people to be able to recognize, oh, this is, yes, I have had those experiences
Mhm.
and I feel this way. So maybe what I need is a trauma therapist too. And maybe I need to learn, what type of therapy might be helpful for me. So that's why I created both Trauma Chat and the blog articles on Trauma Therapist Network.
So the Trauma Therapist Network is at traumatherapistnetwork.com. So how does it work? So someone is looking for a therapist, they go to this site and they do what?
So anybody who wants to learn about trauma can go to traumatherapistnetwork.com. And on the homepage, you'll see all the different things. Find a therapist, um, the the podcasts and their blog is there. But if people are just wanting to search for trauma therapy, they can go to findtraumatherapy.com. I figured that was easier just to have, and it still goes to the main site. So findtraumatherapy.com is the site for searching. And um, additionally, when I started the website in 2021 and I wanted therapists to join it, I set it up as a membership community where they would join for a monthly fee, and that's what they get their listing there. But all the therapists I knew were like, Laura, we love you. We totally support this. It's an amazing idea. But you know what? We don't want clients to find us. We want to hide. There's way too many clients and we don't have the
Oh,
capacity. We're
wow.
exhausted. We're burned out. You know,
Interesting.
2021, everybody was like going, 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 going. And it hit a point where people were like, I'm thinking of closing down my practice. I'm thinking of,
Wow.
I don't want to take any more clients. So I realized then, wow, therapists are like really overburdened right now. I knew I was, but of course I thought it was just me. So I created weekly meetings in the membership instead of just having a listing. Now it includes four calls a month. That one's focused on self care, one's for case consultation, one is for Q&A networking, and then one is some kind of workshop. So
This is at findtraumatherapy.com.
well, that's at traumatherapistnetwork.com. So
Okay.
that's for therapists only.
Okay.
Yeah. And findtraumatherapy.com is to just for searching for a trauma
Okay.
therapist. And it goes to the directory page where people can just put in the city and state or just the state and then, change the search
Right.
parameters to
Right.
be close or far.
Okay.
It's
Well, we're gonna
actually international, but we
cool.
only have one in Canada and one in England so far.
Okay. We'll have all these linked up here at the show notes page at the
Thank you.
traumatherapistpodcast.com. All right. So let's talk about the Wisdom Circle. And I should say that Academy of Therapy Wisdom is a sponsor for this podcast, but I love them and I want to promote them. And you're going to be offering a workshop coming up. Okay, talk to us
Yes.
about that.
Okay, I'm super excited about this, and I love the Academy of Therapy Wisdom too. They're good people, and I love the trainings they bring. So, the Wisdom Circles are two workshops a month, and I understand you do like an integration call too. So, I don't even know what else people get when they sign
It's
up, but
yeah, it's pretty phenomenal actually. But go ahead. This is about
yeah.
you.
Okay. So, my two workshops are both about doing therapy with survivors of sexual trauma. So basically, the first one is going to be about the issue of sexual trauma, sexual violence, and how to work with survivors, whether their situation was recent or long time ago. And then the second one will be more in depth about working with people who are adult survivors of childhood sexual trauma. Because the thing is, therapists who don't have training in working with survivors often have biases that they're not aware of, and they unintentionally say and do things that make the client feel unsafe. And oftentimes they end therapy at that point.
Okay. Give us an example.
Simple example is as soon as someone says that they were, let's say someone is an ongoing client and they come in on their Wednesday appointment and they say, "Oh my gosh, something terrible happened over the weekend. I think I was raped. I was at this party, you know, whatever they think happened." And then the therapist is like, "Oh my God, did you report this to the police?" And the person's like, well, no, I'm not sure. Well, you've got to call 911 right now.
Mm,
We've got to report this. You've got to report this. So it's like immediately the therapist kind of gets scared, has a reaction, and suddenly the client is like their power and control has been taken away.
mm,
You know, they're overwhelmed, they don't know what to do, they're feeling like they're supposed to report and they're not sure if they want to, and maybe they already had a bad experience with that when they went to the hospital if they went. So you know, there's the way we initially respond when we hear is very impactful to the person's recovery from that experience. Um, in the same way, we can have negative reactions when someone discloses past abuse as well. But
So instead of this reactive response, and obviously you would think that the therapist is trying to help, right?
yeah,
What are you suggesting they might do? Obviously, each case is different, but
yeah. Well, you never want the first thing you say to be, did you report it to the police? Because it implies that this has to be reported to the police. So have you done it yet? Or we're going to do it now, or you're going to have to do it, or whatever. Or I, as the therapist, might do it against your will. And basically, what we need to do is just don't have a big reaction. Just be there with your presence, listen, ask. A great thing to do whenever anybody's had a crisis, any kind of tragedy, any shocking, traumatic experience that's happened, in a few days since from when it happened to when you're with them, um, is just to say, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry to hear that happen to you. How have you been doing since then?"
Mhm.
You just want to meet them with calm, caring presence. Let them know that you're listening and you believe them. There's this whole movement. I don't know if you've ever heard about it, but this woman named Joanne Archambault started this. Um, and the movement is called Start by Believing. Because one of the things that people who experience sexual trauma often are met with when they tell someone is disbelief.
Mhm.
So the person who says, "Did you report it to the police?" they are believing. But as soon as the person says, "Well, I don't know if I want to report it," then the other person, the therapist, may begin to wonder, well, is this really
Mhm.
true?
Mhm.
Or did it happen the way they said? Or do they have some other ulterior motive here? All of that, that's not for us to decide. And another thing that therapists could easily do is just to sort of, if this client has had a lot of chaos in their life, if they've had a lot of struggles, let's say substance abuse or um, you know, impulsive behaviors or things like that, the therapist may in their mind blame the client for what happened, like, oh, look what's happened now because of their drinking, now this happened, and sort of looking at it as like, oh, this unfortunate thing that you caused to yourself, which isn't the case.
Right.
um so there's a lot of ways that our biases can really creep in there and cause so much harm and mistrust in the healing process and the therapeutic relationship for survivors. It's really important to get it right. And when I say get it right, it's not about saying a specific thing, it's about giving that message. I believe you. I care.
Mhm.
You matter to me. I can help you. This isn't too much for me. I'm not having a rage response. I'm not having a fearful response. I'm not having a judging response. I'm just here with you. I feel the same about you as I did before this. Those kinds of things are really, really important.
And so oftentimes easier said than done too,
Yeah.
because there's that reaction of, "Oh my God, did you do this? Did you do?" Probably comes from a good place, but like you're saying, can have adverse effects and responses for the client. All right, Laura, so much to talk about. I mean, you're like this wealth of inspiration and information. I'm going to have you back. But
Hmm.
what's the best way for people to learn about everything you're doing? How do they get in contact with you?
Yeah, the best thing is their traumatherapistnetwork.com. That's where everything I do is. And there's a lot of different ways to interact with me. There's the podcast, there's the memberships, there's working as a client, and, I'm on social media. It's all there.
Okay. Again, we'll have this linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Awesome, Laura. Thanks so much for being here. We'll be in touch.
I thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Take care.